Hey everybody. So we're going to be looking at World War I primarily in this chapter. World War I, the causes, the consequences, the aftermath of World War I, the Communist Revolution. Yeah, that's primarily what we'll be talking about in this chapter. First World War, World War I. Afterwards, it was known as the Great War, the war to end all wars. It acted sort of like a forge for Europe, breaking, heating, reforming, and also the entire world, really, into a whole new image. It changes the structure, geopolitical landscape, borders, etc., of the entire planet. Initially, it was expected to last less than a year. It went on for over 4 years, killing millions of people and destroying entire nations. Starts with this, the Bismarckian system of alliances. This sort of lays the framework for what becomes World War I some 40 years later. 40 years later. A system of alliances and treaties develops from 1870s through the early 1900s. And this system of alliances, this web of alliances and treaties, some public, some private, some kept very secret, usually about mutual protection, having someone backing you up, hoping it'll protect you from attack. This largely contributes to, again, setting sort of the basis for the inevitable clashes and conflicts that occur, which lead to the war. So there was a Franco-Prussian War between France and Prussia, 1870 to 71. President Bismarck, he was concerned about keeping France diplomatically isolated, and he wanted to keep, he wanted to keep France as far away, keep it without enemies, to push France away from Prussia. He was also concerned about Austria-Hungary, the Austria-Hungarian alliance, Russian interest in the Balkans. The Balkans is a southeast Europe, basically where Europe connects into the Middle East, the southeast area down there by Black Sea, I believe. There was a power vacuum forming down there because the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. The Ottoman Empire starts to come apart towards the end of the 1800s, and by the early 1900s, it completely fractures into pieces, and leaving this big hole in Southeast Europe and North or Southeast Europe and sort of Southwestern Asia that many European nations wanted to come in and fill and take all that territory. With the loss of the Ottoman Empire, the European countries wanted to come in and grab up all that territory, all that land, all the resources, all the access to routes and to waterways and rivers, etc. And with all this together, it really concerned Bismarck, and he really thought that there needed to be this set of alliances to protect him and his country from the Russians, from the Austro-Hungarians, potentially, from the French especially. The Italians were also concerned. The Italians were concerned about tensions with France. France had been obviously an adversary for all of Europe for much of the last 100 years, constantly causing issues. And so what Italy does is they join this triple alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany to form the Triple Alliance. Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary. So this alliance, before the war broke out, this is 30 years before the war, we see this alliance formed of these countries all trying to protect each other. We got your back. We're going to protect you. Somebody attacks you. That's the whole purpose of these treaties and alliances. If somebody attacks Germany, Italy and Hungary will come to their rescue. And, it works for all the countries. And that's the idea behind these alliances. Emperor Henry William II of Germany, he forces Bismarck's resignation so he could take over Germany alone. He forces Bismarck to resign so he can control Germany himself. William refuses to renew these non-aggression treaties that he had with several countries. That's another way to protect yourself. to sign a treaty between my country and your country called a non-aggression pact. We agree to not attack each other or to have conflict over land or territory. Usually these are countries that share borders. That's the issue. They share a border, and because borders in Europe have been so fluid, constantly changing over the centuries, I could claim this land here, you could claim this land here, and the reality is, in some point in history, my people own that land, and at some point in history, your people own that land. In a way, we both have valid claims. And so one of these ways you sort of get through this is either make alliances to protect yourself or non-aggression treaties. Well, the issue is William decided not to do this. He decided not to renew these treaties, which actually causes an issue with Russia, causes anger with Russia, his refusal to do this. And so what does Russia do? Russia forms an alliance with France. Now, it isn't that Russia and France had a lot in common. They didn't. They'd actually been enemies many times, but they did have one thing in common. They were both enemies of the Germans. So the Russians and the French form an alliance to protect themselves both against a potential German aggression, or Italian aggression, or probably more importantly, Austria-Hungarian aggression towards Russia. England gets in on this. Now, England had wanted to remain neutral in all this. They tried to remain neutral. They had much more global concerns, but they couldn't ignore what Germany was doing. And they couldn't ignore this German-Anglo rivalry. They were right across the water from each other, right across the strait, right across that little thin water strip that separated England from Germany. So they had all kinds of conflicts, water conflicts, all kinds of tensions. Even though they didn't technically share a border, they were close. They shared shipping lanes and things like this. And so they had problems. And with this whole thing with William coming to power and William being very aggressive, and so what they ended up doing is, due to all this competition over trade, etc., and their concerns, they have to start worrying about Germany right across the water, and they have to start trying to protect themselves, and they also want to start forming alliances in case Germany decides to come at them, because navies are becoming a big thing now. 1800s, not as much. Ships were more about trade and transport of people and goods. But by 1900, we now have actual naval fleets. We have steel fleets in the waters, which means a true powerful military presence can come sailing up to your shores. And who knows what's going to come off those ships. So we now have to worry about naval attacks and ship attacks and things like this. And so England has to protect itself. So England decides to hop in on this alliance that France and Russia had. Very ironic, because England, France, and Russia have been age-old enemies. For centuries, these countries have fought each other. In geopolitics, there is I'm paraphrasing, but basically, your enemy today is your ally tomorrow, and vice versa. It's the way it is. It's all about situational politics. Today, we need your help. Tomorrow, we don't want your help. That's the way it is. So we do see this, these three age-old enemies, especially England and France, which have been warring each other for 1,000 years. Really ironic. They now become allies. And the whole reason is they are all wanting to protect themselves from Germany, which Germany is really becoming aggressive, forming this alliance with Italy and Austria, and Germany is basically throwing out non-aggression treaties, becoming more belligerent vocally. They're building up a military, bombs and weapons. They're building up naval fleets. It makes a lot of people in Europe really concerned that Germany is potentially prepping to go on a war footing. And so these alliances are formed to protect each other against the potential dangers of this triple alliance of Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. So you see the triple alliance they're forming here in Central Europe: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy to protect themselves, France and England and Russia to protect themselves, and which I haven't mentioned yet, this is global. You got to consider all these countries have global colonies all across the world, which means wherever a German colony is somewhere near a French colony or a British colony or a Russian colony is near an Italian colony, you can see how it becomes global. Because we already talked about in previous chapters, European countries basically have gobbled up the entire globe and claimed most of the land most of the world's surface area is claimed by some European power, basically, other than China and South America. Pretty much everywhere else is claimed by some European power. And so if they're at war here, that means they're at war everywhere. The outbreak of war with the breakup of the Muslim Ottoman Empire, which really sort of collapses entirely in the first decade of the 1900s. We see all these small nations, like 8 or 10 small nations in southeastern Europe, the Balkans region, basically leaderless now. They were part of empire. Some have been part of empire for centuries. Now they're not. We see all these European powers swooping in, and they start butting heads. I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this. After all, they've been doing that globally for centuries, so there's no reason to think they wouldn't do it now. And so they all come in, and they start running into each other, which causes all kinds of conflicts and controversy and bloodshed, even before the war begins. All right, so Bosnia-Herzegovina and Serbia. This was all part of the Ottoman Empire. These are all regions that were under Ottoman control and had been for a very long time. Ottoman Empire pulls out. So with that happening, these countries wanted independence, as most places did. Whenever their empire, their oppressor, pulled out, whoever it was, the smaller countries, wherever they are, usually want independence. They want freedom. They want to basically make their own self-directed goals, make their own governments, and sort of start anew, after usually being under the thumb of some oppressor for centuries. Well, they want independence. All right. Now, Austria-Hungary moves in and takes over, initially telling them they're going to protect them from the Ottomans in case the Ottomans come back, and Austria-Hungary claims the territories. Basically decides to want to make them, to annex them. That's the term you'll see a lot in World War I and II. We want to annex. That's a very polite political term for basically conquer. They want to conquer these territories and make them part of their country. Now, they didn't really want to be conquered. Now, Francis Ferdinand of Austria, he was assassinated. He was like Archduke, I think. It was Archduke Francis. He was supposed to be maybe the next leader of Austria-Hungary. And he was then killed. He was killed by a Serbian nationalist group. A nationalist group usually means a group that wants their nation to be separate or independent. So we have the Serbian nationalist group, I think called the Black Hand. I don't have it on my notes, but I think that's what it is. And they make multiple assassination attempts on him, and they're successful eventually, and they kill him. And this is sort of the match that sets the fire. The whole fire had already been built. The wood is already there. This is the match that lights it. Because when this happens, when the Serbian nationalists kill what is potentially the next king or the next leader of Austria-Hungary, Austria-Hungary starts bombing Serbia. Well, the problem is Serbia, which refuses to give up its territory, refuses to go quietly, doesn't want this. Austria has German allies. And basically what happens is when they kill Francis Ferdinand, it's in essence a declaration of war. I mean, if you kill who's going to be the next king of a country, you basically have declared war in that country. So this is seen as a declaration of war against Austria-Hungary. But the problem is Austria-Hungary is allied with Germany and Italy. So by Serbia declaring war on Austria-Hungary, even though they don't officially do it, Austria-Hungary considers it an act of war. They're now basically at war with Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy all. Okay, that's ugly. That's kind of messy. But that's just Serbia, right? The problem was Serbia was actually allied with Russia. No one was really aware of that. But the Russians had actually come in and set up an alliance with them before the Ottomans were even gone, because Russia wanted their territory. So Russia had already made an agreement with Serbia. They would protect them. They would defend them. As soon as the Ottomans were gone, they would come in. And so now, with Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, what they've inadvertently done is declare war on Russia, because Russia is Serbia's ally. And Russia starts sending in troops to protect Serbia. Now, Russians aren't doing this for the Serbians. They don't give a shit about the Serbians. They're doing it because they want the land. They want the access to the Black Sea. They want the access... I hope it's Black Sea, I'm right, not Baltic Sea. I think it's Black Sea. And they want access to trade routes, shipping. They want access into the Middle East. They want good territory. There's probably mines, oil, who knows. So yeah. So we got the thing happening in Serbia. They declaring war on Serbia. Russians come in to protect Serbia, which basically means Russia is now at war with Austria-Hungary, which means they're at war with Italy and Germany as well. And so we get the German Austrians versus the Serbian Russians. Well, if it ended there, it would be ugly, but it wouldn't be World War. Here's the problem. Who was allied with Russia? France was. England was. So now we basically have a war between Serbia, Russia, England, and France versus German, Austria, Italy. Yeah, it gets crazy. We go in a period here in 1914, in less than 6 months, of about 14 countries declaring war or being brought into a war, all because of these alliances. All what is known as this Bismarckian system of alliances, which is credited with him, that what had been the president or prime minister or chancellor, whatever his title was, of Germany. Yeah. And now because of this one assassination, we end up within 6 months drawing 14 different countries. All the big ones, well, not us, not the U.S., but basically all the rest of the big ones are drawn into this conflict, this global conflict. And it is global. It's all happening in southeastern Europe, but since these countries are global and they have territories everywhere, it becomes global. It becomes a global war. The Triple Entente versus the Triple Alliance. So Germany had already anticipated this happening. Germany had already written up a plan, because Germany, of course, is surrounded by France on one side and Russia on the other. They get enemies on both sides. So Germany had already developed a two-front war plan, the Schieffelin Plan, which was to conquer France and then go after Russia. To go one at a time. You don't ever want to fight a two-front war being attacked from both sides. So you go after one, try to beat them, and then you can redirect your efforts to the other. That was the idea behind it anyway. Yeah, it was going to be basically a German surprise attack on the French, going through Belgium, which is neutral in all of this. Both wars, Belgium was neutral. But the problem is you've got Germany here and France here, and they do share a border, but right here, you've got Belgium. So basically it's like a three-way, and you got huge Germany and France, and you got little Belgium here. Well, so what the Germans were going to do, because they knew the French probably had defenses on their border, the Germans were going to rush up through Belgium, which was neutral, and then come down into France. Basically a surprise attack through a neutral country. That was the idea. The Germans violate the neutrality of Belgium. The British, of course, are forced to declare war. Don't forget about the Brits, because the Brits are allies with France. And so now the Brits have to declare war on Russia, they have to declare war on Germany, because Brits are allies with France and Russia. I think there was also an alliance with Belgium. I think they might have had, I think even though Belgium was neutral, I think the Brits might have had an alliance or an agreement to protect Belgium in some way or another, because the Belgians, is that the right word? The Belgians were concerned about Russian buildup on their borders, and they wanted to remain neutral. So I think the Belgians had asked the French and the British to basically protect them, even though they themselves didn't want to be directly involved. Bunch of wimps. So again, in a matter of months, you've got Russia, England, France, Belgium, Serbia, Austria, Hungary, Germany, Italy, and altogether like 14 countries that are at war. And World War I begins. All from one assassination of one man. Now, would something else have set this off if Francis Ferdinand hadn't been killed? Probably. There might have been something else. It might have worked out differently. It might have been a different set of dominoes falling in a different way. Who knows? But this fire had been built for a long time. It was just waiting for something major to set it off. The problem is no one expected it to be like this. No one thought that one city being bombed, Belgrade in Serbia, one person being killed. No one ever would have imagined something basically so small would set off what became the greatest war in history. At least the greatest global war in history. There's been other wars in the past we've even talked about here that have taken far more lives. truthfully. Yeah. So we have Ottoman Empire here before 1878, Ottoman Empire after 1878, just gets smaller and smaller. Eventually, by 1914, the Ottoman Empire is basically just modern-day Turkey. It loses almost everything in the Middle East, all this territory. You can see all this. This is on the eve of war in 1914. So basically, this is 1878. We see all this. And then right before the war, Ottoman Empire is retracted into the Middle East, primarily leaving. Hey, I was right about the Black Sea. Yes. And we have all these other small countries which are left over, and all the Europeans basically coming in to try and take them over and control them. You see Serbia here, Romania, Bulgaria, these other places. Greece was one of these countries that was conquered as well by the Ottomans for many years. Yeah. It's really settled down in recent years, but for almost the entire 20th century, this is one of the most war-torn regions of the entire world. All through the Cold War, after the Cold War, this was the entire Balkans region, which is basically this region here between the Black Sea and the Adriatic Sea. This entire region in here, Black Sea, Adriatic, Aegean Sea, you get Italy right here. One of the most war-torn regions in the world, constantly being pulled back and forth between Western European, Eastern European, and Middle Eastern interests. We see a surprise attack here, where Germany chooses to do a surprise attack through neutral Belgium into France. Yeah. And then England over here, which comes to Belgium and France's aid. Once the Germans attack, which of course brings all these other, all of it brings all these other countries into this brutal conflict. Sorry. Stalemate and slaughter. This is a brutal war. Primarily the fighting was done over a 4-year period from mid-14 to mid-18. The war sort of comes to a close in November of 18. But we don't actually have a treaty till 19. So for the first couple of years here, it is brutal, bloody, violent. The Germans caught France by surprise. They really did. They did well. As far as their tactics, it worked well. They invaded France. They got well into France, hundreds of miles into France, before France could basically mount a strong defense to sort of stop them. And they do stop them. They slow them down and they stop them basically in their tracks. But they can't push them out. They stop them, and basically they fight a war for several years in eastern France, between the Germans and the French, primarily. The French finally are able to hold them back somewhere around the Battle of the Marne. You can see the Marne River right here. This is where the French finally mount a strong enough defense right outside of Paris to stop the Germans before they do actually take Paris. But they basically stop them right here, and we get this trench warfare line, which is basically formed. Eventually, they push them all the way back to the edge of Belgium. We'll see that here in a minute. I don't want to get ahead of myself. All right. German surprise attack. The Germans have to retreat after the Battle of Marne. They don't retreat completely, but they do have to back up. German and French forces stalled. We see the stalemate which develops, which is known as the Western Front. Germany versus France and England. Trench warfare, which lasts close to 3 years. Drawn-out period of violence and warfare. Millions dead. Destruction, bombs, artillery, explosions, tanks. We do have tanks now in this war. There's technically planes too. They don't play a vital role. The aerial technology is brand new, literally just invented. So, yeah, there are planes, but truthfully, in this war, aerial warfare, probably the balloons were more effective than the planes. There were a lot of balloons that were being used for spying, stuff like that. Watching enemy movements, whatnot, things like that. The Battle of Verdun was one of the worst battles of the war. There were paintings made about this, stories written about this, books written about this, artists inspired by it. This Battle of Verdun in France, 700,000 dead. 1.7 total casualties. If you ever hear the term casualties, and I use it, you'll hear it in the next coming chapters. Casualty is not dead. casualty includes dead and injured. It's both. So about 700,000 dead and a total of about 1.7 million casualties. So that's a million people injured. And these aren't minor injuries. I mean, sure, there's some minor injuries. But medicine and technology, medical technology was very poor back then. And the majority of the time, if you were injured in some way, the majority of the time you lost what was injured. If your arm was injured, you usually had it amputated. If your eye, you lost your eye. If you got part of your face blown off, you might live, but that was it. I mean, the idea of plastic surgery, it existed. There was plastic surgery, but it was rudimentary compared to what we have today. These are brutal injuries and atrocities and terrible crippling injuries. And so the hundreds of thousands of people who were injured, it isn't like they walked away and had a great life. A lot of them had disabilities and paralysis and amputations and scarred, because this war also used, as I'll mention, this is the first war in the world that used chemical warfare. Poison gas, poison weapons, all kinds of chemical stuff, from air chemicals to liquid chemicals, explosive chemicals. It was gruesome, the kind of stuff that happened in this war. The invent of all of our new technologies, all this industrialization, all the new tech that had really come about and all that through the Industrial Revolution was all brought to bear in this war to invent all kinds of new technologies to kill. This trench warfare lasted close to 3 years, no real change. For almost 3 years, the actual line of fighting, the line of action between the Germans and the French, moved 40 miles. That's it, 40 miles in 3 years. It was all basically just killing each other, popping up out of the foxhole or out of the trenches and shooting and blowing each other up and running back behind the trenches, and you run over there and they kill you, and run over here and whatever you've heard the term, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. This was insanity. The Eastern Front was really bad as well. The Eastern Front, which was Germany versus Russia, millions killed there. Just in 1915 alone, 2.5 million casualties on the Eastern Front. And again, that's dead and injured. Ultimately, this involves all the countries. It involves neutral countries. The Ottoman Empire is brought into it as well, eventually. The Ottoman Empire joins. Italy joins. Interestingly enough, Italy initially entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. And then about halfway through the war, around 16, they realized, I can't speak for what they realized, but something in their politics, they realized they'd chosen the wrong side. And they abandoned Germany and Austria and actually joined our side. They joined the Allied side. And I say our side, U.S., our side. We are not in this war. Make sure you're clear about that. We are not in this war at this point. We do join eventually. So, but they do, back to Italy, Italy does eventually come over to the Allied side of England and France, and Russia also, the Allied, the quote-unquote good guys, if you will, in this. So yeah, Italy joins. Why did Italy do it? Probably because they wanted territory from Austria-Hungary. Every country did what they did in this war, as they usually do, for self-serving interests. Italy joined because they thought it would be more beneficial to their country and have a better opportunity to get land and territory if they joined the other side, the Allied side. Ottoman Empire ends up joining eventually, and actually joining the Central Powers, the other side. The Ottoman Empire eventually joins with actually I get this right, I believe I'm right. Yeah, they join with with Germany. The Ottoman Empire eventually joins with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Not too great effect. The Ottoman Empire was not a key player in this. It really wasn't. I'm sure they had some influence in the Middle East, but outside of the Middle East and the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, probably not much influence. So, worldwide war has commenced by the end of 1914, early 1915. We are in global conflict. Triple Entente, the Allies, England, France, Eventually, Italy joins that side. Greece joins that side. Of course, most of Africa was in the hands of the British or the French. So Africa basically is on the side. We have neutral countries, but almost every neutral country is forced to get involved in some way or another. Spain has their own issues. Spain has their own civil war going on. Spain's got their own crazy stuff going on in their country. There's a whole coup and a military uprising, and it's bad. They got their own war going on in Spain, and so Spain doesn't necessarily play a role in this. They've got all their own problems. Let's see what else is going on here. So basically, you can see Central Europe is basically versus everyone else. Central Europe basically versus the entire surrounding area. And for years, they were holding their own, even though they were surrounded by enemies on all sides. They did very well. These Germans and Austria-Hungary, and primarily Germany was the main aggressor, the main antagonist. I guess the main antagonist in this was primarily Germany. All right, I think we will move on to the next thing. We see the Western Front here moving back and forth. Germany, they got all the way to the Marne, almost to Paris. German offensive, 18. That's this. Not going to get there yet. Trench warfare. Yeah, this was bloody. Much of this war was fought in Belgium. A lot of damage was done to Belgium, but it was mostly, it wasn't Germany, it was mostly fought in eastern France. War becomes global. Ottoman Empire joins. It pulls the entire Middle East into the war. We see the Russians and English versus the Ottomans in the Middle East. Russians and the English had both claimed a lot of territory in the Middle East. So, of course, Russia bordered the Middle East. England wanted it for the oil. And so we see conflicts in the Balkans, in Afghanistan region, in the Middle East, the northern area of the Middle East, bordering up towards Russia. We see it all that, all the way down to Egypt. Egypt, I think, was claimed by the British, I think. I think they do eventually get independence in the 1920s, but I believe Egypt was controlled by the British, technically. It was a British colony at the time. Ottoman Empire does finally collapse, 1914, 1915. England controls Constantinople, the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles is basically that water region right outside of Constantinople, which basically sort of the water line that separates Europe from Asia. Right where Constantinople is. They take Iraq, the Arabian Peninsula. This basically causes the total and irrevocable collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire might have lasted a little bit longer. It might have survived for a while had it not joined the war. But when it joined the war, it went up against what was a very powerful enemy, England. And England had a lot to lose in the Middle East. They knew the oil was there. They already had oil contracts in the Middle East. They were already shipping some oil out of the Middle East. And there's probably other resources too. England put a lot of their firepower, a lot of their ship power, some of their very first planes, warplanes. They're still pretty weak, but their first initial planes into action in the Middle East in 15, 16, 17 to ensure control of the Middle East and what does eventually become very profitable with oil. Australia and New Zealand get involved with this. Australia and New Zealand, which are under British authority, they maintained a very close relationship with England, the motherland. They supported Brit. And over the course of the war, New Zealand and Austria supplied over 500,000 troops to the war conflict, primarily fought in Europe. Indians. India, the continent of India. India supplied over 1 million troops during the war. Over 1 million Indians and soldiers. Don't get me wrong. It's not like they had a choice. They were British colonies. They were ordered. But still, we see, this is global. We see hundreds of thousands of Africans fighting in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, in Northern Africa. Over 1 million Indians fighting in Europe and Africa. 500,000 Australians and Kiwis providing troops, supplies, money, ships, food. One of the things France desperately needed was food. almost the entire eastern part of France was under war occupation or war torn, and that was where a lot of their food supply was. A lot of their farms, most of eastern France was farms, and so they had a real hard time supplying food to their population. So one of the biggest things they needed was food imports, and Australia helped out with that. India helped out with that. Things like this. So yeah, this is global. Japan gets involved. Japan allies itself with England. Japan actually uses this as an opportunity to seize territory in the Pacific. There's German territory in Manchuria, which is northeastern China. Basically, it's that region where China meets Russia, that northeastern region between China and Russia, Manchuria. There's German-held territory up there. The Germans actually had that territory for mines and oil. They lost that to the Japanese. So again, the Japanese got in on it. They were on our side. They were allies, technically, of us. But they were just doing it to benefit themselves in Asia, to gain more power there. This creates more and more tensions between Japan and China, which we'll talk about later. Colonial Africa and Asia. We see the war spreading into Asia and Africa. Colonial troops fighting on both sides. We see German lands being taken in Africa and Asia by the French. We see indigenous troops. We see hundreds of thousands of Africans. We see 1 million Indians fighting. There's a lot written about this by indigenous people, by people in by the educated elites, by the educated people in these areas, and the general consensus was they didn't see a real purpose in it. They're fighting a white man's war. They're not benefiting from it. Their men are going off and dying in wars, sometimes on the other side of the world, or even dying right there in their own regions for no real purpose. Because when the war's over, they're still going to have a white oppressor running the place. There's still going to be a white colonial landlord with military troops and bases and basically controlling their system, controlling their country. Whether it's the Germans or the Brits or the French, it's still some outsider running the show. So colonials didn't necessarily fight because they wanted to. I'm sure there were some loyal patriots who felt loyalty to the colonial power. I'm sure there were some, but the majority, probably the vast majority, they simply fought because they were required to. Usually they use conscription, which is the technical term for being drafted into the military. You're forced to fight. You're required. You don't have a choice. You either fight or you go to prisons or you get some other type of punishment or something. So you don't have an option. So we see these millions of people across the world fighting in this world war that doesn't really benefit them in any way, shape, or form. Whoever wins. All it is a loss for them. They're going to lose money, supplies, lives, family members, and when it's all said and done, it's just going to be some other white European country running the show. The United States finally enters in 17. We had a very strict policy. Woodrow Wilson was the president. He had a very strict policy of neutrality. He was elected in 12. He served 8 years. He made it very clear when all this happened in 14 that he wanted to be neutral. The country was going to be neutral. We're going to stay out of it. And eventually we were forced into it. There was certainly some feelings by some Americans that we should help out our English-speaking Christian neighbors, and the fact that almost the entire U.S. population, 90% of the U.S. population, was descended from Europeans. You have about 10% of the population that is black or Asian, very, very small percentage Latino, and even those almost exclusively would have been Mexican at the time period. The vast majority of the U.S. population were whites, Christians, and almost all descended from Europeans. So there was a very strong feeling that we should help our sort of the homelands where we came from. But there was also other issues too. Almost half of Americans in the time period could trace their lineage to Germany. Like 45% of Americans could trace their lineage to Germany in the time of the war. That caused a lot of issues because those were the bad guys. And we generally agreed Germany was bad. Even though most Americans, half Americans could trace lineage to Germany, or actually were here first generation from Germany, we still believed, and it was pretty clear that the Germans were the aggressors. The Germans were the ones doing this. Well, the Germans made it easier for us to choose sides in this. They had unrestricted warfare. They would destroy our ships, they sink our ships, kill our people, our sailors, our merchants. Hundreds and hundreds of ships destroyed in the first couple of years. Thousands of American lives lost, mostly civilian lives. Sinking ships. They even sunk, I don't know if I have it in my notes. I don't have it in my notes, but they sunk the Lusitania, which I think was a sister ship to the Titanic. Titanic sank in 12, so this is a few years after that. And they sank that ship, which had like 200 Americans on it. Unrestricted warfare. We were neutral, but we really weren't. We had been giving food, supplies, and weapons to the British and the French since the beginning. We declared neutrality, but we made it clear for anyone who understood what was really happening, who was actually in the know, which Germans, I'm sure, had a strong intelligence network. I'm sure they understood what was happening. We had been secretly supplying help and assistance to the British and the French since almost the beginning of the war. So we had chosen sides, even if we hadn't actually. And a handful of Americans went over and fought, but we never officially entered. So the Germans didn't trust us. They didn't like us. They believed we had already chosen sides. So they didn't think twice about destroying our ships all across the Atlantic primarily. And then they do this crazy thing. They actually send a message to Mexico. We'd had conflicts with Mexico for years. They sent a message which becomes known as the Zimmerman Telegram, which basically they tried to convince Mexico to attack us. Basically, they tried to convince Mexico to launch a war against the United States to take back their territories. All of basically the southwestern U.S. had been part of Mexico. Everything from Texas all the way over to California, like 8 states, all of that had been Mexico at one point. And so they said, you need to wage an attack and try to retake that territory, and we will eventually send help over to you. As soon as we get France conquered, we will send over troops and soldiers and basically help you retake the southwestern United States. We get this. Somehow we intercept it. Again, it's just a telegram. It's easy to do. Somehow we intercept it. It's published in the newspapers. And a huge rallying cry across the country where people like, oh my gosh, they're destroying our ships, they're killing our people. Now they're trying to basically get us into war with Mexico. Mexico declined, by the way. Mexico made it very clear in their responses to Germany. They wanted no part of this. It would have been very bad for them. Mexico would have not stood a chance in a war or conflict with the United States. And Mexico very wisely wanted no part in it. They declared neutrality. They completely wanted no interest in it. But it still made us very angry. It made Americans very angry, and declared this to find Lusitania and other things. Made it very clear that we had to make a decision and choose a side. And we do choose a side in 1917. We do join in 17. The war had been going on for years by that point. Millions already dead. We were constantly criticized by the Allies that why we didn't get involved earlier. But we didn't. This is one of those things I was talking about before where there's like artwork and this really... A lot of the craziness of this war and things happening in Spain as well inspired artists, musicians, writers. And look at the guy. Look at the person in this. The Assault, Verdun. Henry de Gros, look at his face. I mean, look at this guy's face. It's nothing short of pure abject terror. Most of these people fighting this war were 16, 17, 18-year-old boys. They'd never seen anything like this before. The brutality, the violence. He's... The type of feelings and the type of courage it would have taken, or the type of insanity to do this. It's a sign of chaos, this whole scene of chaos, madness, insanity, as he's driven to craziness. This is a face of insanity, which is the idea that they were trying to portray. This war was insane. It's really hard to really describe. I was in the military for years. I never saw war directly, so I can't speak to this. But I knew a lot of people that did, and I've studied this. And I speak for myself, we can't really understand. Until you've actually been in something like this and actually been there, you can't really... We can talk about it all day long, but we can't really understand the psychosis involved with this, how it affects our mind. They did not use the term PTSD back then. That wasn't a term. I don't know when that was invented, but we didn't have it in World War One. But they did have a term. It was called shell shock. The idea of how it affected you, your people would come back and they would use the term their brains are scrambled. Millions of men walked away from this war all across the world, especially Central Europe. They just were never right afterwards because no one had ever experienced something like this. Just brutal slaughtering. Because you got to understand, it isn't just shooting people. That's terrible. But look at all these guys. They've got guns. Their rifles have bayonets on them. Much of the combat, much of the killing was done face to face. To where you're looking at someone 5 feet away from you, 3 feet away from you, and you're literally ripping them apart. You're just cutting them, slicing them. Their guts are spilling all over the place. The gore, the blood, the violence. You can't really understand it unless you've actually done it. It's not a video game. And you see all the dead bodies here. You see all the dead bodies at the bottom. Verdun, 1.7 million casualties in one battle. First time on a global scale, we see the line here between civilian and soldier was blurred. War becomes about materials, morale, national unity, a lot more than soldiers and guns. It's often said in World War I and II, this war was fought half on the battlefield and half back at home. And we're going to sort of get into why half of the war was fought at home for a variety of reasons. Become much more about war, about materials and supplies and food and morale and family. A lot of examples of this. The German government established the Raw Materials Board, for instance. It inventoried everything from oil to manure, fertilizer. It rationed everything. It rationed all. We see this all across the world, though. All these countries involved had massive rationing of food, supplies, clothes, any type of fuel, water, you name it. Butter, milk, eggs, everything was rationed. You were controlled what you could get. You were given ration sheets. You were given cards. You were given documents. You could only get this amount of bread, this amount of water, this amount of food. The governments in many of these countries took over all control of production. They basically nationalized production in many countries to where they controlled all the manufacturing to ensure that everything that was being produced went to benefit the war effort, or the majority of things produced went to benefit the war effort. Germany is an example here, but America did this, England did this, France did this, all these big countries did this. Auxiliary service law required German males between 17 and 60. You were only allowed to work at jobs that is what's called war cause employment. You could only work at a job that benefited the war. If you were basically an adult male who was under retirement age, you could only work in jobs that benefited or join the military. Just about everyone worked to support the war cause all across the world. England, for instance, ran out of money. They ran out of money and supplies, and so they had to do the same thing. They had to ration. They had to control the supply of goods, food, everything. Everything was rationed and controlled, what you could buy, when you could buy it, how much you could buy. They organized a lot of private industry. This was basically this nationalization to where the government sort of controls or takes over all the private industry, or regulates the private industry, might be a good word, to ensure that they're producing things for the war effort. Ministry munitions. Munitions is explosives, bombs, bullets, things like that. Anything that has gunpowder, explosive, things like that. They controlled labor, they controlled profits, they controlled the wages, they controlled any type of labor disputes, factory disputes, they controlled who you could hire, how many people you could hire, when you could hire people, and you could only produce things for the boys on the front. Or the boys, as we said in America, the boys over there. It was referred to as over there. That was often the terminology. Those that went over there. Or on the home front, or on the front. Sorry, the home front is home, but on the front. The front is where the war is happening. And we had to, of course, control everyone. We had to basically control the narrative. We had to control what people thought and how they felt about it. We had to control propaganda, news, movies. We had to control the media. Such at this point, we had movies and we had radio both. So we had to control all that, what people saw, and sort of what they absorbed, to make sure that what people understood was that the war was necessary, that it was for the right reasons, it was for a good cause. Your brothers, your fathers, your sons are dying for a just cause, and we didn't allow people to speak out against it. It's really ironic. During World War I and II, we were often quoted, our government, our presidents often quoted that we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for democracy. And yet, ironically enough, during the wars, we basically stifle that. We stifle democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of press. We don't want speech or press that in any way puts the war effort down or in any way challenges the government's decision to go to war. We want 100%, there was terms we used in America, was often referred to as 100% democracy, 100% support for the war effort. You had to do that. You had to give, publicly at least. If you talked privately in your home about what you thought about the war, so be it. But publicly, whether voice or print or media of any sort, you were supposed to support the war effort. If you didn't, you got in trouble. In America, we created the Espionage Sedition Act. We were to control the civilian population. We spied on them. We put people in prison, propaganda, arrested folks. We didn't allow protesting or marches. Basically, anything that was anti-war was shut down by the government. Wilson ordered this stuff. Congress ordered this stuff. And it was generally unanimous. Our government wanted everyone 100% behind the war effort. The Germans did this, the French did this, the Brits did this, lots of countries did this. They expected everyone to support the soldiers, whether you did or not. And if you didn't do it, you were going to get in trouble. Our fighting for democracy and freedom, only you just didn't have those freedoms during the war. Now, it could have been dangerous had these things continued into effect after the war, the basically restrictions on freedom of speech and press, for instance. Yeah, it might have been a problem, but they didn't. These acts, as soon as the war is over, these things are repealed or canceled. I'm not even going to talk about what happened with... There's some interesting stuff that happened with Adams, President Adams, back in the 1790s, which is interesting, very similar to this, right at the beginning of our country. We've had these issues several times, to where we're all about freedom, democracy, and freedom of press and speech, until it's not convenient for a national cause, and then suddenly there is no freedom of press or speech. This is something to be always aware of and always vigilant on whenever the government starts to, or politicians start to talk about, maybe you don't have freedom of speech or press in this situation, or in this instance. Really scary line to start walking down. Because once you start making exceptions, say, well, you don't have freedom of speech in this instance, or in this instance, what's to keep you from adding more and more instances? Got to be careful. Luckily, it didn't lead us into that dark corner in either World War I or II, even though we stepped into it in both wars. We luckily were able to walk out of it in both cases. Basically all countries created laws for drafts, conscription, which is basically being forced to fight in the war. This is forced military service. We've done this in America many times, going all the way back to the mid-1800s. I believe the last time we did have the draft officially was in America was the Vietnam War. I don't believe we've had that since, to where we had forced conscription. But we had it during all countries did. All the countries had this. We did this happen. It was legal. Now, in some places of the world, it was practically slavery. Places like India, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, some folks are forced into basically, they don't have a choice, and they don't have any rights, and they get little or no training. They're in essence given a gun and forced onto a ship and then shipped around the world to fight the wars of Europe. These colonial militaries, very badly treated, and you had no option to get out of it. When you join legal conscription, there's a contract. You have to do a certain amount of service, certain amount of time. You fulfill your duty. You walk away, generally. In the colonies, you didn't. You could be conscripted, and you could be forced to fight for years with no end in sight, no end to the contract. It could be permanently renewed. You're basically a slave soldier. I know you might think it's a, how to put it, it's a distinction without a difference, but I would argue it is a distinction with a difference. It's not the same thing. The way the colonials were treated was much more harsh than citizen soldiers. And the opportunities they had no legal protections. As a citizen soldier, you did have legal protections as well. You had contracts. You had obligations. The military owed you things, like they owed you medical care, they owed you pay. None of that stuff was guaranteed for colonial soldiers. Many of them had to work basically for free. They had no protections afterwards, no guarantee of medical care. Being conscripted is rough. Being drafted in the military is rough. But at least when there's rules on it, and there's structure rules, contracts, legal protections, that's one thing. These colonial draftees had none of that. It was far more harsh and worse. Women, we do see women taking a very strong role in this. We see women, factory workers. Again, the men, millions of men went off and fought. The factory jobs are still there. So we see millions of women moving into factory jobs to replace the men who are gone. So you see a dramatic increase in females in the workforce in these home countries. They get to break through traditional expectations. They get to have jobs, get better pay, better opportunities, better money in their pockets. Oftentimes women are supporting the families. Very different roles for millions of women that they had ever had traditionally before this. And we do see social freedoms. We do see levels of equality in many countries that they'd never had before. The problem was when the war ended, most of them had to give up all of this. Most of them had to give up these levels of equality, freedom, economic security they had. They had to give up these jobs. Most of these social gains they weren't lost, but they were reduced after the war. We do see when the war is over, many more women working than ever before. We see a decrease in the gender pay gap between men and women. Still, men make a lot more than women, but you go back to the 1800s, men would make 2 or even 3 times what a woman would be making. It's much more reduced by 1920s. So yeah, there's some advantages. Women, like for instance in America, Woodrow Wilson actually really pushed and he almost single-handedly gets the 19th Amendment passed, which gives women the right to vote. And he calls it a reward for women, basically a war measure as a reward for what women did in the war. Would women eventually gotten the right to vote in America? Yes. But it would have happened probably years later if not for Wilson's actions. Wilson really made it happen as a direct reward for the millions of women that stood up and did the men's work while the men were off fighting for democracy. But a lot of women did have to basically step aside when the men came back. It was expected that men would get the jobs. They get their jobs back. There was also opportunities for immigrants, migrants, minorities to get these jobs because a lot of minority people, a lot of immigrant workers were able to take jobs that had primarily been done by whites before. So we do see opportunities there as well. And women's suffrage, that's women's voting. It happens in America in 1919 and 20, but we see almost all your Western European countries give women the right to vote in the 1920s. So there are a lot of advantages that come out of social, economic, and political advantages that women gain from this war. This is an interesting never forget image. This is a French N'oublions jamais. I don't know, am I saying that right? It talks about, this is basically the emotions. You're supposed to get the emotions out of this. Here we have a French woman with a dead baby. The city's burning in the background. This is a German soldier hat. I think it's German or Hungarian. Let's see what my notes say. We have the woman defenseless here. We have the dead baby, the crib, the blood all over the place. An alcoholic bottle here. That's remember, everything in the picture has significance. The city burning. Maybe the idea of you're supposed to have the instinct of protecting the woman, protecting the children from the terrible Germans. I think this down here is supposed to be like a German helmet. And the Germans were often categorized as being alcoholic, drunks, violent. Whether, Germans probably, the Germans and the beer, but they probably didn't drink any more than anyone else. Idea that the Germans were frenzied, uncontrolled, senseless in their violence, alcoholics, undisciplined, drunk, violent, dangerous, perhaps, but maybe no different than any other soldier. Women were often victims during wartime. We just talked about in the previous slide how there's a lot of advantages that women got socioeconomically, politically of the war, and they did. It certainly increased opportunities for women and rights for women during this wartime period. But at the same time, during any major conflict, women are often abused, sexually assaulted, raped. That always happens. And it's not one side or the other. There is not a good side or bad side. We often see soldiers from either side in especially occupied territories, which always happens in war. We invade them, they invade us. We occupy their towns, they occupy our towns. We often see the invading soldiers committing atrocities on the local civilian populations, murdering innocents, raping women, killing people who are not combatants, known as non-combatants. We see this in every war. We see this every country doing this. The French did this in German territories when they do eventually invade Germany. The Germans did this in French territories. The Russians and the Germans did this back and forth. We see American soldiers doing this. I don't know of any stories particular in World War II or World War I. It probably happened, I would imagine. But I know quite a few stories in Vietnam, for instance, what American soldiers did in Vietnam, raping, murdering, killing innocents. Everyone does it. It doesn't in any way excuse it, of course, but it is a common thing. It is an aspect of war that's often avoided and not talked about or glossed over. It's always focused on the battlefield and the soldiers fighting, which is significant and important, and that is where most of the killing and the atrocities occur. But it needs to be understood that not on the battlefront, lots of other bad things happen. Lots of other atrocities are committed in areas where they're not fighting and shooting bullets. And this sort of shows a little bit of that. This is sort of demonstrating basically how terrible the Germans were to the women, the children, the innocents. But don't misconstrue and understand other people did it too. The Germans did this, but other countries and other populations do the same thing. It kind of harkens back to that image of Verdun, the previous one we looked at. War makes people crazy. It makes soldiers crazy. It causes a type of insanity. The type of violence that you have to do, the type of mentality you have to shift your mental thinking to being, okay, I'm okay with literally ripping someone apart. That's what you do sometimes. I'm literally okay with just slashing a person and ripping their guts out and watching their guts and their brains all over the place. Or having my friends next to me having their bodies explode all over me. That shit happened a lot. Artillery shells would come down and blow 20 men to literal pieces. And all the other men who were a little further out would get their friends, their comrades, their trench mates, maybe even family members, literally their guts all over them. Can you imagine what that does to your psyche? I can't imagine. I can talk about it, and I understand intellectually, academically what it does, but actually understanding how it affects you. It changes you. And so these men doing these things in these wars when they weren't on the battlefield, atrocities to women and other types of things they did, it doesn't excuse it, but it's sort of understandable when you consider what it does. It sort of fractures them. The end of the war, the U.S. decides to get involved with this. The U.S. adds about 2 million men and weapons on the Western Front in 18. We don't really actually get involved. The U.S. really doesn't get actually involved until 18. The war started in 14. It's about 4 years later before we actually put a bunch of troops in Europe. Even though we joined in 17, we'd actually been building up since 15, 16. We don't really put our money where our mouth is until 18 and actually put troops on the ground. When we do, we come in force. In a matter of months, we put over 2 million soldiers, weapons, and bombs and artillery into Europe. We basically break the German back. The French had held them off for years. We come in and sort of slam dunk it. But we had all the advantages. Our soldiers were clean and prepared, and they weren't tired and worn out. They had new weapons, new supplies. They came out and all patriotic and ready to fight and defeat the terrible Germans. And when we do this, the war ends almost immediately. When the United States puts its full military might into it, the war is over 3 months later. Which leads a lot of people to argue, had the U.S. come in earlier, could we have brought the war to a close earlier and potentially saved hundreds of thousands or even millions of lives? Probably. But we would have lost more American lives. Like I said, at the end of the day, what a country cares about most is its own interests. We're no different than anyone else. We see a lot of discontent as the war goes along. We see increasing mutinies. We see threats of revolution, discontent. We see Germans rising up. Some of the defeat actually happened internally. Some of the German commanders or German units which refused to fight. There were entire German units, hundreds of soldiers, that would actually, there's multiple instances where this happened, where they actually waved the white flag, stood up out of the trenches, and walked over to the French. And hundreds of soldiers mass surrendering. This happened multiple times. It wasn't a majority of the military by any means, but it happened repeatedly. We see sailors doing this, ships mutiny. We see revolutionary councils modeled on the Russian Soviets. We see revolutions in the in Russia. After several years of war, many people were simply tired of fighting, and they didn't know what they were fighting for. Some of these German and French lines hadn't moved. Really, they'd been stuck in the same trenches for a year, 2 years. And so we see this. Army discipline collapses. The emperor, the actual emperor of Germany, he abdicates, which means he steps down from the throne, and he flees. He actually runs. He flees to Holland. Austria-Hungary surrenders in the middle of the year, and the war basically comes to a close on November 11th, 1918. Now, the armistice, what is armistice? Basically, it's an agreement to a ceasefire. It doesn't officially end the war. The war isn't officially ended until there's a treaty signed. But the armistice is, in essence, an agreement by the major parties. We're going to stop shooting at each other. It's a sort of a waving the white flag on both sides. No, that's the wrong way to put it. White flag means surrender, so don't look at it that way. It's not that. It's. I guess I'll leave it the way I said it. It's both sides having a mutual agreement to a ceasefire. That's basically what the armistice is. November 11th, 1918, which is our holiday we celebrate here in America, I believe, is Veterans Day. That's our Veterans Day we celebrate in the U.S. It ends with a whimper. As soon as the Allied forces, led by the Americans and the British and the French, as soon as they invade Germany, Germany just immediately surrenders. Now, probably a big part of that is because their emperor, their I don't know. I guess he was an emperor. He was an emperor. He surrendered. He surrenders, abdicates, steps down, and he runs out of the country. I don't know. Is he afraid he was going to be captured and executed? Probably. So he runs, and basically Germany's left without any command, at least at the highest level. And then the Americans show up with millions of fresh troops and new weapons and supplies. The French and the British are rallied and excited, and they start a huge push, and this massive Allied invasion crosses into Germany, and boom, Germany surrenders. Much different than what happens in the next war. Yeah, in essence, everyone was tired of fighting on both sides. The Germans welcomed it. They welcomed an end to the war. They don't welcome what happens after, but they welcome the war ending. This was a war that was almost entirely instigated and pushed and controlled at the highest levels of government. Almost every single German soldier by the end of the war was a forced conscription. Almost every German soldier, something like 90% by the end of the conflict, were forced conscripts. They didn't join the war on their own merits. They were forced into the conflict. Once the Germans saw an opportunity to end the conflict, they immediately surrendered. They wanted it over. Everybody wanted it over, really. All right, so it ends. We see all kinds of new territories, sovereign nations, sovereign meaning independent nations. We see Austria-Hungary separated into two separate nations. We see a new nation, Czechoslovakia, formed. This was all formed at Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary becomes Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia. We see altogether about a dozen new states formed. Altogether, Poland is new formed, Yugoslavia is formed. All these are new places. I think almost all five of those, I think, came out of Austria-Hungary. All these new, altogether about 12. Altogether about 12 brand new countries. All reformed, all borders reformed, rewritten, redrawn. The entire map of Europe was redrawn into it looked a whole new structure. 1919 Europe looked nothing like 1914 Europe on a map. The Ottoman Empire falls completely. It ceases to exist after 1918. It's not an empire anymore. It's not considered an entity really anymore. All told, we see these numbers are interesting. Some books will put the death toll at World War I as low as 8 million. Some put the death toll as high as 17 million. Depends on how you categorize it. If you look at every person who died during this conflict globally, all of the local people, the indigenous populations, all of the people who died during the war of like starvation, malnutrition, because wherever wars are fought, they're fought across usually fields, and fields are farmland. So typically when wars are fought like this, there's hundreds of millions and millions of acres that are basically destroyed, burned, blown up, whatever, uninhabitable. You can't grow crops. And so you have all kinds of people that starve to death, die of famine, disease, malnutrition. The waters are polluted with the war, the chemicals, the slaughtering of animals to feed the troops, all kinds of stuff. If you look at all the effects, plus that 17 million number might also include the Spanish flu, which was the flu which basically covered the world and killed millions of people, which is sometimes glossed over because it happened during the war, and the war is the big thing. But the Spanish flu was terrible and killed, who knows, 10, 15 million people worldwide or more. I think that number, that's wrong. That's a wrong number, sorry. The Spanish flu killed over 50 million people worldwide. Yeah, so if you look at the total amount of death, if you look at full wide global conflict, not just on the battlefield, but all the deaths from all of the other stuff, disease, the Spanish flu, we're not even talking about the whole, the Armenian genocide, which happened in Armenia, Southeast Europe, where the Ottoman Turks basically executed 1 million Armenian Christians over the course of the war. all under the cover of the war. When you throw in all that, and you really look at all of the things combined, you're looking at a death toll potentially of 100, 120, 140 million dead. Yeah. What do you say? I don't know. Yeah. The war to end all wars, the Great War, was much bigger than just the war fought on the front lines on the Western Front between Germany and France. It was much bigger than that. The Treaty of Versailles. This is the treaty that officially ends it. There's been more than one Treaty of Versailles. This is the big one, the one that is the most important. There's been dozens of treaties of Paris and a couple treaties of Versailles. I don't know how it ends up, but apparently France is just a place where people like to meet. I guess it's sort of centrally located in Europe, and so lots of countries will meet there and discuss treaties and alliances and stuff like that. Treaty of Versailles is what officially ends the war. Wilson had what he called a 19-point plan, which was this whole 19 points, a very idealistic idea of coming in and having all these ideas of how we're going to have a very peaceful, equitable end to the war, peace among equals, things like that. It was entirely scrapped. Not by Wilson, but by the people at the different negotiations after the war. Basically, England and France scrapped it. They wanted nothing to do with it because what Wilson's 19-point plan basically said is, we're all done, let's all be friends and shake hands and sort of work out very equitable arrangements for all the countries involved, including colonial lands. Let's all sort of figure out a nice, peaceful way to work this out to where we can all have this peace among equals and everyone gets fair treatment when the war's over. England and France said, F that. England and France said, we didn't start this war. We've taken the brunt of the attack, especially France. We want our pound of flesh. We want Germany and Austria. Well, again, they totally destroy Austria-Hungary. They tear it up into 4 or 5 different countries. They completely rip that apart. They want Germany to suffer. Yeah. The only thing of Wilson's 14-point plan, or 19, I say 19. Is it 14 points or 19 points? I don't have that in my notes. I'm gonna change that. I think it's 14 points. I think it's a 14-point plan. I believe it's 14. The only part of Wilson's 14-point plan that did not get scrapped really was the League of Nations. He had this idea of a new a non-country body, an independent, neutral body that would be a place for all the countries to come and basically negotiate and work out their differences. It becomes known as the League of Nations. And it is this idea that we will be able to protect countries from aggressor states. Instead of fighting, we'll come to a table, negotiate, and try to work out our problems. Most of the countries thought this was a good idea. They generally signed on to it. It would ideally protect the small states from aggression from the big states, and we could potentially avoid another war. Yeah. That didn't work. It also included all kinds of stipulations, that this war guilt clause. Basically, Germany and Austria had to accept all responsibility. They had to pay reparations. Reparations where you got to pay back for damages. Basically, you got to pay back because you caused the war, or you were the aggressor, you caused the most damage. And so Germany and Austria had to accept responsibility, pay back reparations. Billions. I believe Germany alone was expected to pay back $33 billion in damages, which was way greater than their entire gross domestic product of the country. They were supposed to pay back. It'd be like if you were worth $100 and you were sued and you were expected to pay back like $1 million. I'm like, I got $100 in my bank account, or I got maybe more realistic will be $10,000. I got $10,000 in my bank account. You sue me for $1 million, and the court says I got to pay $1 million. I got $10,000 in my bank account. There you go. That's all you're getting. That was what it was with Germany. Germany didn't have the money to pay this back. Germany never paid back these reparations. They paid back parts. They made payments, but they never even got anywhere near that 33 billion plus interest they were supposed to pay back. England and France just wanted everything out of them. They wanted basically, and it was a lot more than that too. They wanted, we're not to 3 yet. They wanted, France got mines, got oil fields, got territory. Germany lost about 20% of its entire territory. Yeah. Pretty bad what they expected from Germany. Another big part of this was the Middle East. We see a very area of discontent. We have all kinds of clashes. The Germans, the French, the British, the Russians, the Ottomans, which are now gone. But you have Hungary, which you have Turkey, which is being formed. Yeah, you got all kinds of problems over there. Jews in both England and America gave millions of dollars to support the war effort. Jewish families had a lot of banking and business interests. They heavily supported the war effort, and in reward, British government and the American government agreed to try and help them get a homeland back in the Middle East, this Jewish homeland. There were many Jewish Zionists. Zionism is simply this idea they wanted a homeland. They wanted their own place. Instead of being dispersed around the world, they wanted an actual place to call home, a traditional homeland. And as a reward for much of the war efforts and much of the money and things they did to help, we see, and there's other factors too involved, we see this push for a Jewish homeland. There's also a lot of anti-Semitism in England and America. A lot of anti-Semitism towards Jewish populations. Protestants were still generally not friendly towards Jews, and England and America were Protestant nations. And so there was also it was a two birds with one stone. We're going to basically make deals with these Jewish families and Jewish businesses to give millions of dollars to help support the war effort. And in reward, we will give them land or try to get them land in the Middle East from our territories, while simultaneously we're able to ship millions of Jews out of our countries. Anti-Semitism played a very distinct role in this, trying to get and help Jews have a homeland outside of England and France. That was as big a part of it as basically their war assistance. Arab people, of course, didn't want this. Middle Eastern Arab people didn't want this. It was their land. This had been Muslim-controlled land for, give or take 1,300 years, 13 centuries? Almost the entirety of the Muslim calendar. The Muslim calendar starts, I don't know the exact date, but basically around the time of Muhammad, it starts. So for almost the entire history of Islam, this had been Islamic lands from the beginning of their history. Yes, these areas, what becomes Israel, had been Jewish homeland in the Roman Empire over 2,000 years ago. But it had not been for a very long time, even though there had always been some Jews that lived there. There had always been some Jewish populations that had lived there. Well, since almost the entire Middle East was under control of England and France, they agreed to create a homeland for the Jews. This was promised to them during the war, and they sort of follow through with it. This was this Balfour Declaration, which was this basic promise to create this homeland and for the Jewish populations. Well, Arab people weren't consulted on this, and they didn't agree with it. They didn't want it. Furthermore, several of these regions, Iraq, for instance, was actually told they would get independence if they assisted in the war effort, if they actually helped and fought in the war effort, and some did. Some Arabs did fight. And they were promised with their assistance that they would be given independence. That didn't happen. So we have European countries following through on their promises to the Jews and then pulling back on their promises to the Arabs. This causes rising discontent between Western powers, Jews together versus Arabian powers, Middle Eastern powers, Muslim powers, which still are an issue to this very moment. Let's see what else we got going on here. What do we have on this map? This is after World War II. After World War I, we see all these other territories, these new countries formed, these new regions. All of this had been basically Austria-Hungary. Now, Prussia had been in here. This had been Prussia before. And in the Franco-Prussian Wars in the 1870s, basically Prussia was gone. And Prussia was pretty much divided up into Austria-Hungary and Germany. So Prussia had already been pretty much dissolved in the previous century, and its territories had been broken up between primarily Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now Austria-Hungary is broken up and see all these new territories formed, these new regions altogether. About 12 new states are formed, which that's a country. 12 new countries are formed. All right, I'm going to move on to Russia. Talk about the Ruskies. Okay. The fall of Imperial Russia. Mutual distrust developed between Nicholas II and the Duma. The Duma, basically that's the parliament. It's the Russian parliament. And the Tsar, that's the Tsar, the Emperor, the Caesar, the Tsar as they would call it. He took over control of the government. He fueled growing criticism of his rule. He's a Romanov. Combined with several million, this basically leads us to millions of Russians died in the war. Remember, the war's going on. So millions of Russians end up dying. By 1916, there had been about approximately 2 million Russian deaths. So 2 million Russian deaths. It doesn't appear as though the Russians are winning the war. Germany appears to be going strong. Him having all these issues and problems. Many people came to believe he was a corrupt leader, a corrupt, I guess emperor, I guess was the right term for him, the Tsar. We see the March Revolution, 1917, the women of Petrograd, if I have it on here, no. Petrograd, Russia, they protest in the streets, talking about the lack of bread and food for their families. They're starving. They're protesting all their men are being taken away to fight in the war, their fathers, their brothers, their sons. And they couldn't feed their families. They couldn't find work. This starts riots. The Tsar actually orders the Tsar orders soldiers in to put down the revolts and the rebellion. After a short period of time, it's found that the soldiers are actually joining the rebellion because the soldiers are rebelling as well. We saw that in Germany by 1918. We see German units rebelling. We see entire German units, hundreds of soldiers rebelling, revolting, surrendering, all kinds of stuff. We see the Russians doing the same thing. We see Russians believing this war is not serving any purpose, and they start to give up, and they start to rebel or revolt against the government. Very interesting. These riots led the Duma to actually declare a new government. Nicholas II must abdicate. He must give up his throne, and they could declare a new provisional government from this March Revolution. This basically spells the end of imperialist Russia. The Tsar has to give up his power. A new government takes over. That's kind of it. It just sort of ends. It's actually, other than these protests, it's not really bloody yet. That's coming, though. This new provisional government comes in. The new leader of the government is chosen. Alexander Kerensky becomes the new leader of this new Russian government, which turns out to be an interim government. We don't really know that at the time, but it comes to be a temporary government. He establishes some very interesting things. A liberal socialist society, freedoms and equality, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to unionize, the right to strike. Creates a sort of a social democracy. But it's short-lived. This is not the way Russians had ever been governed. This is not the way Russia had ever been governed, ever in its history. This was alien to people. A lot of folks didn't understand it. This was Western European stuff. This is Western European ideas of equality, freedom of speech and press, which isn't like it was 100% across Western Europe, but at least it was sort of there in some places. Yeah. A problem with it was, and maybe the biggest problem was is it wasn't willing to do enough. This new government was unwilling to seize land, to confiscate land and property. It was unwilling to take over and basically nationalize. During a war, and pretty much all these major countries did this, in World War I and in World War II, they nationalize. Meaning everything in the country becomes focused on the nation. Production, employment, manufacturing, transportation, consumption, consumerism, almost everything has to revolve around the country and the good of the country. Some people want to do this. Sometimes the government has to force people to do this, as we previously talked about. He won't do this. Kerensky won't do this. This new government doesn't want to do this. It doesn't want to take land. It doesn't want to nationalize the factories. Bear in mind, they're still fighting the war. They're still at war with Germany. And he's basically unwilling to make the hard decisions, believing in a more freedom, sort of a democratic government. Great. If he had tried doing this when they weren't in a world war, maybe this would have worked. Unfortunately, he was trying to do it in a situation where they needed to really keep control of Russian society, to really keep order, and to continue to fight the war. It really required a much more heavy hand. Sad to say that, but, well, we'll see the results of his more light touch. This more democratic, more liberal touch didn't work. It worked very poorly. He lost control of the military after he issued an interesting thing. He issued Army Order Number 1. It actually removed authority from the officers, and he actually gave it to the people. Gave it to the enlisted soldiers, gave it to the actual regular soldiers. Bear in mind, most of these regular soldiers, Army officers are career soldiers. If you're an officer, most Army officers enlisted by choice. Most Army officers, it was a family thing. They went to an academy. They had official training. They usually volunteered. Most officers would have done this. They are career soldiers. They have chosen this career, and they're much more loyal and dedicated. Your typical enlisted soldier was conscripted, forced in, didn't do it by choice, would much rather be back on the block doing things with their family, their friends, their kids, their siblings, going to school, working in a regular job somewhere, etc., etc. And so when he did this, he basically gave all the power to the lower ranks, took away the power from all the officers. Crazy, basically flipped the whole thing on its head, and all these enlisted men looked around and said, wait, we're in charge now? Screw this shit. And they all basically went home. like half of the entire army just dissolved overnight. Which anyone looking at it would have said, of course that was what was going to happen. You expected all these Russians to be loyal and want to go off and die on some bloody battlefield? No. Most of these are 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. Nah. The whole army basically dissolved overnight. Anyone looking at it objectively would have said, well, yeah, that's probably what's going to happen. And it did. It's funny if it wasn't so disastrous for the country, really. All these peasant soldiers and farmers left, and the army just sort of... This idea of freedom and equality led to total anarchy. In essence, the entire structure of Russian society just sort of collapses overnight. And of course, it's not literally one day, but it's in a very short period of time. It's in a matter of weeks that the entire structure of Russian society just falls apart. Army desertions, nationwide anarchy, this agrarian upheaval, what's called, because most of these people who are working had been farmers, peasants, workers, laborers, and so we see all these people who are the soldiers, basically the bulk of the entire military, just being like, yeah, we're done. Drop our guns, let's go back home. Yeah. Collapse of civilian order, society, anarchy, chaos, and Russia devolves into chaos and anarchy in a very short period of time. And of course, they're still fighting the war, technically. Yeah. All right. Vladimir Lenin. Yeah. Vladimir Lenin. A villain, if there ever was a villain. Ranks right up there with some of the worst. He came to power in 1917. He stressed three important ideas. First, violent revolution was necessary. Violent revolution is required to overthrow the old order to install the new order. Violent revolution to overthrow the old order to install the new order. A socialist government was necessary. A socialist revolution was necessary, which is the idea of putting the power back in the people's hands, putting the power in the people, of the government, for the government. Basically, the idea of the government and the people being the same, this idea of a social agreement between the government and the people to take care of each other. This idea of socialist revolution. And the results of the revolution have to be determined by leadership, not history. He was one of these guys that wanted to sort of delete, and there was a lot of book burnings actually under this new Bolshevik government, where they tried to eliminate history. They wanted to eliminate any type of history that didn't have it in the power of the new Bolsheviks, these new liberators. Powerful leadership was necessary, of course, himself being the leader. As Russians became known as Marxists, believing in the social ideas of Karl Marx. They consider themselves the proletariat. Marx always talked about and wrote about in the 1800s about the proletariat rising up to overthrow the bourgeoisie. Simple terms, the working class rising up to overthrow the middle class. The middle class that had the power and the money. So the poor rising up to overthrow the wealthy, the middle and upper classes, primarily the middle classes. Who really had the power, the authority, the money. They ran the industries, they ran the factories, things like that. Lenin called his followers the Bolsheviks. He was exiled from Russia because initially he was exiled from Russia over fears that he would do exactly this. He would lead a massive revolution. He actually was exiled from Russia, ended up in German hands, was arrested by Germans and thrown in prison by the Germans. If only he'd stayed there. Well, with the help of the Germans, Lenin does eventually return to Germany, return to Russia. The Germans actually help him escape. It's sort of a deceptive thing where it appears as though he escapes, but actually what happens is the Germans help him escape, and what happens is exactly what they expected. I don't know who predicted this, but someone in the German command authority predicted that if Lenin made it out, he promised to overthrow and create a revolution in Russia, that if Lenin got back to Russia, they might actually destabilize Russia and take Russia out of the war. Exactly what happened. Lenin gets back to Russia, starts a revolution, destabilizes Russia, and then almost immediately, once he comes to power, forms a non-aggression treaty with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which we'll talk about in a second, and basically pulls Russia out of the war. Exactly what the Germans wanted. Quite convenient. It worked well for them. Worked very well. Lenin, he returned to Russia, was very critical of the government. He attacked the provisional government, and eventually the Bolsheviks take over. The Bolsheviks, by 1918, control and take over the Russian government. That provisional government that was put in there went away very quickly. Leon Trotsky, who was a supporter of Lenin, he led the Bolsheviks while Lenin was not around. He basically was Lenin's lead general. So Trotsky helps take over the government, all in the name of Lenin, all in the name of the revolution, all in the name of the Bolsheviks. He does this. He arrests government officials, executes government officials, and even before Lenin completely comes back and takes power, Trotsky declares Lenin the new leader of this new society, this new revolutionary society. Lenin is proclaimed leader before he's even quite able to take power. And then as soon as he gets back and has an opportunity, he assumes authority. Basically, Trotsky held it for him for a while, all in the name of him until he came back. He was a loyal, dedicated follower. Years later, they hunt him down and assassinate him. for all the terrible things he did, him and Lenin. But that's later. Let's see. This is a Russian propaganda poster. It says in Russian, have you volunteered? Trying to get you to volunteer for what becomes known as the Red Army. And we're going to talk about the red versus the white. We get basically a red versus white conflict going on. Eventually it becomes known as the Red Army under what is established as the Soviet Union here. So we have a factory in the background. This shows that you are working, you're a man of the people, you're working for the people. The idea of the Bolsheviks are the people, the workers, the laborers. This is, the entire propaganda and the entire theory behind this is the working laborer people taking over and running everything. This was their version of socialism. Everything is divvied out equal, everyone gets a fair share. It's really interesting. On paper, socialism actually sounds pretty good because everyone gets fair treatment, everyone gets a fair share, everyone gets what they do, what they earn, you get what you deserve, there is no homelessness, no poverty, no one goes without. But the other side of it, of course, is, again, in theory, that also means there's no necessarily power or authority. It's much more challenging to elevate your status, to work your way up the ladder. You're sort of stuck in the middle somewhere. But in reality, it's all BS, because in reality, what happens in socialism and what eventually leads to this in the communism is basically an oligarchical power at the top, to where you have a small group of power-hungry people or political power at the top, which then basically oppresses the rest of society. That's what happens. But the ideas of it sound great. The ideas to the masses are everyone gets what they want, everyone gets what they need, no one goes hungry, no one starves, no one's forced to do anything they don't want to do. We're all here to help each other out. Like we saw in America in the 1960s and 70s, these communes. You're all working towards a common goal to everyone benefit and help each other out. And the reason I'm mentioning all this is because that is the propaganda they used. The idea of the workers helping out, taking care of each other, all working to support each other for the good of the country, for the good of the Russian people. It's about patriotism and nationalism. We're going to take care of ourselves versus the enemy, whoever the enemy is. Have you volunteered? Volunteered to help out. Now, yes, as a soldier, yes, but have you also volunteered to help in the factories? Have you volunteered to help your neighbors? It is sort of enlisting this idea of everyone needs to do their part. Now, all governments were doing this. The American government was doing this. The British, the French government was doing this. In a little different terms, but it was all sort of supposed to inspire this idea of nationalistic pride in your country, patriotism, we might call it, although it's not exactly the same thing, to stand up and protect and take care of your country and protect your neighbors. It really works. Especially if you are a people living in poverty that are worrying about your next meal, worrying about your job, marching in the streets because you don't have food to feed your kids. It's the solution. And it really works. It convinces most people that this is what you want, this brighter future, but there is a caveat. To get it, you have to go through a stage of violence. As he says, violent revolution. You want to get to this sort of utopian, this promised theoretical utopian society of everyone gets what they need, everyone's happy. To get there, you have to go through this. And that's what is a little more challenging. You have to get the people willing to go through the blood to get to the daisies, if you will. So volunteer, fight, however's needed. Whatever's needed. Compare this to that French poster. There's definitely some comparisons. It's a different way of looking at it. It's not about bringing anger and frustration and hatred to bear. That's not, which is sort of what that French poster was. Hatred of the enemy and anger and disgust and vengeance. This is more about nationalist, patriot. Ultimately, it's to get you to the same place. Volunteer, join, do your duty, help out, work to the greater cause. It's just sort of two different ways to go about it. But the ultimate cause is very similar. This patriotic nationalist idea. It just goes about it differently. All right. So, he made a deal with the Germans. He gets back, takes over, and fulfills his deal. The treaty is signed. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 1918. Basically, he goes back, it takes over Russia, signs a treaty with the Germans. They surrender from the war. They actually give up a huge part of their territory. About 1/3 of the entire Russian population is now German, is now under German authority. Huge chunk of the entire Western Russian Empire, they just carve it out and say it's yours. Now, admittedly, this only lasts for a short period of time because Germans lose the war very shortly after this. But Russia backs out of the war, and now suddenly it's just Germany. France is going to get the full brunt of German attack. Historians have looked at this clearly, and had the United States not gotten involved when it did, it's very possible, maybe even very likely, that the Germans would have overrun France. Because they were fighting a two-front war. Their army split for the entire war. Now that Russia was out of it, Germany and Austria-Hungary could have focused their entire war effort on France. The U.S. coming in when they did prevented what might have been a German victory. Maybe. We don't know. But it certainly could have gone that way. This frees Lenin to pursue his goal of absolute control. The Bolsheviks were renamed in 1919 the Communists. They become known as the Communists. Lenin takes over absolute power and basically becomes a dictator. Communism worked out great. Their version of socialism, yeah, not so good. Well, then the Reds and the Whites come in. There's a lot of Russian sectors that still support the Tsar. The Emperor, the Tsar, is technically still around. They've been exiled / imprisoned, the royal family, but they're still around. And so there's still people that say this is the actual real leader. This is the actual real authority. The Romanov family should be the ones really running. It shouldn't be these revolutionaries. It shouldn't be Lenin. And so their forces are identified as the Whites. And then Lenin's forces are identified as the Reds. Leon Trotsky, continuing to do his job as the faithful supporter of Lenin, basically runs this Red Army. He's brutal. He's violent. They're cruel. They capture entire units of the White supporters and execute all of them. Mass executions. Thousands upon thousands of supporters of the Tsar and the Romanovs killed in mass executions, public executions, locked in churches, and churches burned down. Crazy stuff. The Reds, this great, wonderful socialist revolution that they had, was just massive bloodshed. Now, Russians are pretty much used to this. This war had been going on for years, the World War, and then plus, of course, life in Russia was rough as it was already. You had to be tough to be a Russian. So the Red Army, under control Leon Trotsky, takes a few years. Finally, at the Battle of Vladivostok, they defeat the White Army. Tens of thousands dead. Mass executions. Very ugly. The Cheka becomes the Red Terror. These become these secret Russian executors. This is these mass secret police, which basically murder, execute, imprison anyone who speaks out against the new communist government. They hunted down, execute thousands of the foes. They executed the Tsar, his entire family. Yeah. Yeah. Violent revolution, anyone? Lenin promised it all the way back in 17. Lenin promised that this had to happen to bring in a new era, of communist, socialist, for the people, by the people kind of ruling. He gave what he promised. He is considered he's certainly ranked up there in one of the top 10 violent, most destructive leaders who killed their own populations. That's one of the things that makes Lenin unique among this small category, is his violence, his destruction, his murderous rampages, and his resulting deaths ultimately during his tenure as I don't know, first citizen or whatever the hell he was called, resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of Russians. That's one of the things that makes him unique. It wasn't like Hitler did. Hitler killed millions of other people. Hitler was responsible, of course, he ranks right up there at the top too as a terrible person, but Hitler primarily targeted outsiders. Primarily, his war brought death to others, even though, yes, he did kill millions of German Jews. His aggressions were mostly focused outward. Lenin's were entirely inward. Lenin killed all of his own people. Tens and tens of millions of his own folks. The revolution never ended. That's the thing about Lenin's communism. Until the day he died, his revolution never ended. Even though he had total iron control of Russia, he always believed there were large elements in Russia that didn't approve of his governing, didn't approve of new communism, what becomes the Soviet Union, this the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, or more commonly the Soviet Union. He always believed that anyone who didn't support this new communist effort was an enemy. And that enemy ended up being tens of millions of his own citizens that were executed, murdered, starved through all the different programs, the agricultural programs, people thrown in all the prisons, all the prisons out in Eastern Europe, Eastern Asia. Hundreds and hundreds, millions of people basically disappeared. Yeah. He wasn't waging war on the world. Lenin waged war on his own population for years, executing millions upon millions of them in a variety of ways. Here's the territories given. Ukraine, that's interesting, considering current events. Bolshevik territories occupied by allies, boundary of the USSR, and of course the USSR becomes our great adversary of the United States for almost the entire rest of the century. Even the next 20 years, when they weren't our enemy technically, they were still really our adversary. We were friends during World War II because we had to be, but we really were never friendly with the communists going all the way back to the time of Lenin. We were never comfortable with them. We were really political, geopolitical, economic adversaries of theirs. Other than those few years during the war in World War II where we had to be allies, we never really ever considered them allies, not really. So we spend much of the 20th century the enemies of this, created by that man, Lenin. That's it. Wasn't that fun? Very interesting stuff in there. Thanks for going through it with me, and we shall see you next time.